So this is going to be a project about policy support, which I think is very important. And in fact, what I'm going to present today is the result of a big project, EU-funded project, which is called Capable for Climate Policy Acceptability Economic Framework. And I thought it was a good idea to present this here because this is a project gathering different institutions. And so kind of multidisciplinary project, which is also a bit the idea of this type of conference here. So in this project, we have 11 institutions. We have economists. We are economists at the CNRS and ESEC team. For example, there are also economists from the University of Barcelona. But we also have climate modelers and climate specialists from the PIC, for example, the Potsdam Institute from the CMCC. We have also a team of psychologists from Groningen University and a team of political scientists from the ETH. So this is a team with different institutions and different disciplines together. And what we do in this project, and we have 5 key objectives, well, the overall objective is to develop new methods for socio-economic decision-making in the context of climate change. This is the first one. The second one is to enhance the empirical knowledge of public perception of climate policies, and this is really what I'm going to talk about today. And we have some other objectives, but ultimately the idea is to design some actionable and effective climate policy recommendations. And what I would like to focus on today is on this second objective, which is to enhance the empirical knowledge of how the public perceive climate policies. Okay? And for that, what we do is that we use large multinational surveys. So what I'm going to do today is to present you the results of the first wave of the survey. A big survey, a lot of data in many countries, and I would like to present you the data so that we can launch some discussion. Okay, but let's start with some word of context. So we know that the current climate change mitigation policies, at least the one that have been implemented, they are not sufficient to reach Paris Agreement's objective. So the objective, as I remind you, is to get lower than 2 degrees increase in temperature and being as close as possible to 1.5. But the current policies, the ones that are implemented, they are not sufficient to go there. So the second fact is that if you take advanced economies, globally speaking, it represents more or less 80% of global greenhouse gas emission. So what this means is that if we want to achieve the goal, the Paris Agreement goal, if we want to achieve this, we need these countries to take urgent action and aggressive action. So we have to act fast and we have to act, well, we need to take aggressive action to do a lot of effort, okay? But the feasibility of designing, implementing, and maintaining climate policies, this very much depends on citizen support, okay? And especially when you are in a democracy. So the support of the public is very important if you want to maintain these policies, okay, and to put them in place. So the policymaker in democracies, in our type of countries, they faced a dilemma. Well, at the same time, they need to significantly reduce emission, okay? This is one thing. But at the same time, yes, the most stringent measure, the most stringent mitigation policy, they are also typically the ones that are not supported by the public. If you think, for example, to the taxes, carbon taxes, okay? And you have the example of the yellow jacket in France, for example. So typically, this is not very much supported. So how do we do that? Okay? Let me talk a bit about the literature a bit, what has been said or what has been typically, what is the research saying. So there is a large literature on public opinion, on climate change policies. And typically, public opinion is considered as a key ingredient, as a key input for policy making, because these determine behavioral changes, these determine policy adoption, and overall the policy effectiveness. So here you have some recent paper about that, but there is a big literature on that. And typically the research has focused on, the research on this political feasibility of the policies, it has focused on who supports the policy. Okay? It has focused on supporters, typically. And what we wanted to know is, okay, who are these supporters? What are the characteristics? How the support will change if you change the policy design? So typically, it has focused on supporters. Here you have some recent papers. Most of them are very well published, so you can have a look. Recently, there was kind of a change. Another type of literature emerged in which we try, or the researcher tried to identify what is the source of backlash against the climate policies. And then it was moving from exploring the supporter to more exploring what are the strategies for making the policies more appealing to opposers. So focusing more now on those who oppose the policies and what could be done so that they support a bit more. So this is more recent. But we think in general that still, well, there are many papers in the literature, but there are still some gaps. And these are the gaps that we would like to address. Two main gaps. The first one is that we know very little about a third group, which is very crucial. It's not the people who always support, neither the people who always oppose, but those who are in the middle. Okay? So there is very few about this. Okay? And why is it important to know what these people in the middle think, what is the opinion of those people? Well, it's important for different reasons. The first is that typically policies, it will target the median voters. And chances are very high that the median voter will be in this middle group. Okay? The group is also very large. Okay? The group of middle is also very large. Okay? It's a large segment of the population, which means that if we want to achieve majority support, we need to have this group on board. And a third important factor is that the perception of this group, they may be fluid, they may be malleable. This means that these people, they can be persuaded. Okay? They can be persuaded in one direction or the other. Of course, what we would like is to persuade toward in the direction of having stronger support. Okay? And this very much depends on the condition that will be implemented. Okay? So this is the first gap that we think is in the literature, is that there is not enough focus on this middle group. The second gap is that there is, except a few exceptions, there are a few papers, but there is very limited research on how the support vary within individual across different policies. Okay? So typically we have support over climate policy in general, about any climate policies. Okay? But we know very little about the within individual variation. Okay? So what we would like to know is how stable the preference of people are, okay, in their position for or against climate change. Okay? On what depend the support? Maybe there are some policies that some people support, but another policy, the same person will not support it. So what are the characteristics? What define whether you support or not? Okay, so we need this within individual variation. Okay, so this could provide valuable information on who, so it means the proportion and what are the characteristics of those who can be persuaded. If we know that, we would know how we can persuade people. Okay? And then ultimately, this would help policy design and communication strategy toward having more acceptance. So what we do in this project is that we have a representative survey, or a survey on a representative sample of the general population in 13 EU countries. And what we do is that we focus on 15 different climate policies. Okay? I will show a bit later, but the policy have different characteristics. They differ in the design type, in the implementation level, in the sector, etc. Okay? But what we mainly do is that we categorize support along two dimensions. Okay? The first dimension is the overall level of support. And there, as I will explain, we define three groups: the opposers, the supporters, and those in the middle. This is the first dimension. But then we have a second dimension, which relates to the consistency of support across the different policies. And there we have two groups. We have those who are decided and those who are conditional. Okay? I will be a bit clearer in a moment. Okay? But given that we have 3 and 2, this enables us to identify the 6th phase of climate policy support. Okay? 3 times 2, and we have 3 different types. Okay? And then in the paper, or in the project here, we examine which type of climate policy each of the 6 phases will support or oppose. We will try to identify what are the characteristics, the composition of the different phases, on what it depends, on which socio-demographics, characteristic, climate attitude, voting behavior, etc. So try to investigate the characteristics. We also try, there are some questions about how they perceive the impact of climate policies. And we also have a question in which we explore what are their preferences for allocating the revenues coming from the ETS. So I'm going to present, I would like to present a bit all the result of this. So it will be a kind of descriptive presentation with a lot of data, and hopefully this will generate some discussion about climate policy support in general and our data later. Let's go with our data. So we have this data from 13 EU countries, which are Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, Denmark, Spain, France, Greece, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, and Slovenia. In total, we have a bit less than 20,000 observations, 20,000 individual. And we investigate the support for 15 different climate policies. Okay, we also included a bunch of control and other type of variable, like the climate change belief, or whether they're worried about climate change, etc. We have also the question about the impact expectation, personal value, political attitude, and a bunch of socio-demographics. Okay, and the data was collected last summer, during the last summer, so it's pretty recent. So let's have a look a bit at the, first of all, to see a bit what is our sample here. So here the first question is how worried are you about climate change? Okay, and just to have an idea about what is the population saying about that, and what we see is that, okay, we have extremely worried, very worried, somewhat worried in yellow, and not worried at all in red. Okay, and what you see is that in general, if you have here all the different countries, and here you have the old data together, is that overall 80% of the people are at least somewhat worried about climate change. Okay, so 80%, this is this part. Okay, and if you take it per country, there is here a bit some distinction in the Czech Republic, but in general, more than 66% of people in each of the 13 countries are somewhat worried. So this is the first thing. So people are worried about climate change. Well, probably not new. What we also wanted, given that the focus is on climate policy support, what we wanted to do is to get a sense of how knowledgeable they were about climate policy in general. And then, of course, given that the Fit for 55 package is the cornerstone of the European climate policy, we gave them some information about it. And what we told them is that recently, the EU has developed a package of policies which is called Fit for 55, and we give them the objective. The policies aim to reduce net greenhouse gas emission by 55% by 2030 and achieve climate neutrality in 2050 across the European Union. So we give them this information, and then we ask them, okay, but before today, how informed would you say that you were about this policy package, about the Fit for 55 package? And they could report the degree of knowledge on the Likert scale. Okay, and what we have here is here are the results. So in red, this is where they are uninformed. So from very uninformed to somewhat uninformed. And in this blue-green, you have when they are informed. And probably unsurprisingly, but what we observe is that 66% of the people, they are uninformed about the climate policy in Europe. Okay, so they are not that much knowledgeable about climate policy. Okay, there are some difference between countries. For example, the degree of knowledge is in Spain is 30%, but typically people are not knowledgeable about this package. So now let's focus on the policy and on the support. So as I was mentioning before, we have 15 different policies that we investigate here, and so we wanted to have kind of a wide range of different policies with different characteristics, and these are typically the policies that are either already implemented or currently debated in the different sphere. And what are the characteristics or the difference in the policies? One difference could be the governance level. Some of the policies are implemented at the EU level, others are really framed at the country level. So this is one of the differences. I will tell you which are the specific policy in a moment. Another difference is the sector. Either the policy apply to all the sector or only focus on agriculture, on transport, on energy. Another difference is the design type. So some policies are more market-based, others are more regulatory. For example, the market-based, the ETS, bans are much more regulatory. Okay. And we have also a difference in the implementation of the policy. Some are already in place and are part of the Fit for 55 package. Others are just currently being debated and discussed. So overall, we ensure that all these policies, they reflect what is going on these days, all the contemporary climate challenge and all the discussion. What we also wanted to do is to focus on stringent policies. So some policies that really require substantial behavioral changes or financial costs. Okay? We wanted really to focus on those policies because typically they are the most effective. Okay? So we didn't consider the softer ones, softer alternatives such as information campaign or voluntary measure. No, we wanted really to focus on the most stringent one. So let me show you the policy we choose. So we have 5 policies which are already included in the EU Fit for 55 package. Well, the EU ETS in general, and we ask them what is the support. There is the extension of the ETS to fuel for heating, the extension of the ETS for road transport. There is a ban sale on all the new vehicles after 2035, what Andre was referring to. But here, the current one is with some exemption, okay, some exception for some cars. And we have the CBAM, okay, the carbon adjustment mechanism. So these are the 5 already implemented. Then we have other at the EU level which are currently discussed. And for example, we have a ban on all the new cars after 2035, so no exception there. We have a ban on intensive cattle. We have the extension of ETS to agriculture. We have a ban on ads, on emission heavy goods. Ban on private planes which use fossil fuels. And the EU rail funds to expand the network and lower the price. And then we had some policy which was specifically focused on at the national level for each of the different countries, which is, we have 4 policies here: an increase in the tax on beef, tax flight, which would increase the price domestically in this country by 50%, an increase in tax on fossil fuel profits, and mandatory insulation. So these are the 15 policies that we considered, and for each of them, we ask how much are you opposed or in favor to the policy, okay, using Likert scale. Okay, so these are the type of results I'm going to show you. So we just, based on the Likert scale, I will just present who oppose, who is neutral, and who support it. And here we have all the different policies, okay? The result here, the first result will be for France. We didn't have Switzerland, so here it will be for France. And for France, this is what we have in general. So what do we observe? Well, typically, there is more support for the policy which are more carrot type, okay? For example, here, you have the EU rail funds, 73% support this type of policy, okay? Or here, the insulation, 65%, okay? There is also support from those policies which are seen as symbolic, as something right to do, right? For example, here, the ban on private planes, okay? 67% support the policy, or a tax on fossil fuel profits, here 60%. So those policies are kind of well supported. What is less supported is more the stick type of policies, like the tax on beef, with only, whereas the tax on beef, only 22% support the policy, or the car phase out, only 25% support this type of policies. Now, with all these 15 policies and all the support we have of the different policies, what we wanted to do is to characterize people along these 2 dimensions. The first dimension was the level of support, the second is the consistency of support. How we do it is we use a very simple approach. So first we compute the aggregate score across the 15 policies. So -1 if you oppose, 0 if you are neutral, 1 if you support the policy. And then we just compute the sum of these, okay? And then we use a threshold approach. We just say, okay, now if the net support is more equal to 5, you are called a supporter, okay? If the net opposition is more to 5, you are called an opposer. So if the sum is less or equal to 5, -5, you are called an opposer, and the rest is in the middle. So those who oppose mainly, those who support mainly, the rest in the middle. Okay? Then we have the level of consistency of support, and there we use a ratio of number of policies that are support versus opposed. So what we mean there is that if you support at least 3 policies, and at the same time also oppose at least 3 policies, so you support some and you oppose them, then you're not really decided, and we call them conditional. There are some policies you oppose, some that you support, you are in conditional. Otherwise, you are called someone who is decided. And then we combine the 2 dimensions to obtain the 6th phase. Okay? So those dimensions, it captures both the strength and the stability of preferences. So here's the result about the classification. Here we have the number of supported policies from 0 to 15, the number of opposed policies from 0 to 15, and then, so here, this would be someone who do not support any, do not oppose any, always neutral. Okay? Here, someone who only oppose. Okay? And then you have everyone's there. Okay? In blue, you will have the decided, you will have the opposer. In yellow, you will have the person in the middle, and in green, you will have the supporter. And then in light, you will always have the conditional, while in the dark color, you will have the decided. Well, what we see is that if you take the middle plus the supporter group, this is the vast majority, 80% of the population, okay? Which is not a bad news, right? What we also see is that if you only focus on conditional, so conditional, those who support and oppose at least 3 policies, so those at this upper part, then we have 50% of them, okay? So 50% of them are classified as conditional. Okay, the preference vary depending on the type of policies. They will oppose some policies, they will support some policies, but this is huge. So this is a big part, this conditional. And then what we see is that the biggest group is this conditional middle. Okay, 1/3 of the sample here, of the population here. Which also means that there is potential for their support to be switched in one direction or the other, and of course, this is a good news. If we can do something to make them switch towards support, this would be a good news. So this conditional middle is a very large group. And here you have also the distribution over the different countries. Typically, this idea that the conditional middle is the largest group is very much the case in most countries. There are some exceptions like Spain or Sweden, but otherwise the biggest group is really this light yellow. So here, what I show is that a bit what I did for France here. This is for the full sample. So this is the type of support for all of the 15 policies for the full sample. But now what I want to focus on is more about the 6 different phases. And let's start with the supporters. Okay? The supporters, what we see is that typically the decided, and the decided are the one with the stripe, if you can see the difference. So the decided are in stripes, and here the dot are the conditional. But typically the decided, they have higher level of support than the conditional. Okay? So if you look here, these are the decided, this is the conditional. Okay? So clearly, well, the preference of this group, they are quite stable. The decided have more support than the conditional. But if we look at the middle and the opposer, this is the opposite. Okay? So typically, the conditional have much more support, okay, than the decided. And here, the same. Okay? So what it means is that typically, even in the opposer in the middle, there is some possibility potentially to mobilizing support. Okay? Those are the conditional. Their support could switch. Okay? Now, let's have a look at some of the characteristics of the 6th phase. Well, here it's by gender age. There is nothing emerged really. I mean, the classical pattern, maybe the men, they oppose a bit more. Some standard result, if you look at education, typically we have the result that higher education is also associated with higher support. Okay, so this is the standard result. What is probably a bit more interesting here is when you look at attitude and some behaviors. So here we have different type of variables. So how worried you are about climate change, whether you have high biospheric value, whether you trust the EU Parliament, whether you trust the national government, whether you voted at the latest European election, the low limit of consumption, whether you take 2 or more flights per year, whether you use your car every day, and then we see what happens for the different phases. And typically, well, this is not surprising, but the supporters, they are more likely to be concerned about climate change, have trust in political institutions, being politically engaged, and having more behavior which is aligned with with the low carbon lifestyle. This is probably not surprising, okay? And what we see is that the middle is much more heterogeneous, okay? Typically, this is indeed between the supporter and the opposer, but typically we also have in this middle and opposer group, we have the conditional, then the light, they typically have higher concern, higher biospheric values here, higher, they are more worried, okay? So those conditional, typically, they're also more closer to the type of supporter action, okay? And so it means that higher level of climate belief may unlock some support, okay? Something about what they voted at the latest election here. So we gather so we ask them for which party they vote and then gather into different groups. So here you have the Christian or the conservative, here are the Greens party, here the socialist or left party, libertarian and nationalist parties. And well, probably unsurprisingly, the supporter, they are more likely to vote for Green parties here or for left parties, okay? And the opposer, they are more likely to vote for radical right nationalists. This is probably not surprising to many of you. What is interesting, I think, is that even in those who vote for a radical right nationalist, there is a high share of conditional and conditional middle, 35%, for example, here. So it means that even in groups that are presumably hard to reach, there is some potential to motivate people, okay, to achieve more support. Even those who vote here for those parties, for example, which we may expect are much more difficult to reach, right? Now, let me say a few words about impact, how they perceive the impact, these different phases. So what we did is to evaluate. So you remember we had 4 policies which were defined at the national level. They were the beef, insulation, tax on fossil fuel profit, and the tax on flight. And so each respondent had one of those policies randomly assigned, and they were asked the following. They were asked, how do you think that this policy will impact 4 things? How it will impact your country greenhouse gas emission? How it will impact your well-being and lifestyle? So here we try to assess how they perceive the benefit of the policy, okay? And then we try to assess how they perceive the cost of the policy, how it will affect the country's economy, and how it will affect the financial situation of their household. Okay, so the cost. So we try to assess what was the cost and the benefit of the policies. Okay, of course, this is very subjective. Huh? So what we have here is that we have the 4 policies: tax on beef, tax on flight, mandatory insulation, and tax on fossil fuels. And here we have for the different here what they were required to assess, okay? Emission reduction here. So these are the benefits: emission reduction, positive impact on well-being, and these are the costs: negative impact on the economy, negative impact on the financial situation. And what do we observe is that typically those who support, so the green and the yellow, those in the supporter and the middle, typically the conditional, they perceive greater emission reduction, okay, greater benefit than decided. So typically, what I mean here is that typically the light is higher than the dark color, okay? So the conditional, they perceive higher benefit, okay? But if you look at it, the conditional, they also perceive more higher cost than the decided. We have the same here for the cost, so for the negative impact on the economy and for the negative impact on the financial situation. So this is always higher. So the conditional, they perceive higher cost and benefit than the decided. Well, what does it mean? That probably for them, this cost-benefit calculation is more salient for them, for this conditional. So this is a point that is important for them. What will be the cost? What will be the benefit? Okay. If you look at the opposer, well, typically, they perceive a very high cost, okay, on the policy, lower benefits, and, well, typically there is not so much difference between the conditional and the decided. So what we did then is to pool the support for the 4 different policies And we wanted to have, well, some econometric analysis in which we regress them on the perception on the four different impact. Okay? So these are the results of the regression. So here you have the 6 phase, and here are the X variables, so emission reduction, positive impact on well-being, negative impact on the economy, negative impact on the financial situation. And what we see is that typically the benefit, they have positive value, significant positive value. Okay? So if you perceive a benefit of the policy, this will affect your support positively. Okay? This is probably not surprising, but this is important that we get the data to see that. So the perception of a positive impact will affect your support. So importance of perceived benefits, this shape preference, and then it also tells us that we need to have effective communication strategies. Okay? We should communicate the benefit of the policies in order to gather support. This is an important determinant of support. If we focus on the cost, we have really some variation across the 6 types, across the 6 phases. And typically, for middle and opposer, so if we focus on the blue and the yellow, the conditional, so the light one, they associate economic costs. Okay? So the light one, so this one and this one, this is significant and this is negative. Here also, significant and negative. So it means that for them, if they perceive some cost, this will also affect the support, but affect in the other direction. This will decrease the support. So for them, clearly, it has a strong effect. For the decided, this is not the case. It's very low. Okay? So for the decided, this doesn't change much. In any case, whether there is a cost or not, well, they are just against. It will not affect the support. Okay? So these results show us the importance of also mitigating the perceived economic impact if we want to build support, at least among this group, about the conditional group, which is the one who could be turned, who could be persuaded. Okay? So now what I would like to do, and this is the last thing I'm going to present here, is we ask them, okay, according to you, what would be the priority for redistributing the revenue from the ETS? So we told the subject, well, some of the current funds which are generated by the ETS will go to the so-called social climate fund. The social climate fund can be distributed in different ways. Okay? Now, if you could choose how to distribute these social climate funds, how much priority would you give to each of the 4 options? What were the 4 options? Option 1, compensating the vulnerable households which are affected by the transport and energy costs. So compensating the households. Second option, compensating the workers which are affected by the decarbonization. Option 3, investing in climate adaptation. Option 4, investing in climate mitigation. Okay? And for each, we ask, okay, what is the priority from lowest priority to highest priority? So we compute kind of an index of priority, a priority index, which rank each option relative to the other. And this is what I show here is the value of this index for the 4 options. Compensate the most vulnerable households, investing in adaptation, compensating the vulnerable, workers, and investing in mitigation. And then you have the priority index for the 6 phases of climate change support. What we see is that middle and opposer are the blue, middle are the yellow. What they prioritize is clearly compensating the most vulnerable household. Okay? What they prefer is to have something tangible, concrete, in the near term, to protect the people who are most vulnerable. Okay? For them, this is the priority. For the supporter, what they prefer is clearly to invest in mitigation, which is more long-term type of measure, which could bring systematic solution. Then, well, all of them, there is a consistent preference for adaptation measure. So here, everyone seems to agree. Okay? And there is kind of limited priority given to compensating the worker. So here it's negative of 0 for everyone. Okay? So it means that the labor market adjustment seems to be less of a concern. well, let's focus on what is the message, what can we get from this. So what I think is important is that the preferences toward climate change policies, this is not something which should be treated as binary. It's not either you support or you oppose. No, it's something which is more multidimensional, and we should acknowledge that. Okay? Here we proposed one way to categorize and to study this is to distinguish the support and to distinguish two dimensions. Okay? One is the overall level of support, in which we have three classes, three groups, the supporters, the middle, and the opposer. And the second dimension is how the support is consistent. And there we define the conditional and those who are decided. Okay? What are the main findings here is that probably neither the middle group, neither the opposer, they should be considered as kind of a lost cause, those who are against. No. Even within the opposer, the preference, they are dynamic, okay? And especially among those conditional, okay? So it means that some of those, even among the opposer, some of those could be motivated towards more policies, more support toward policies. So their preference can vary, okay? And this will depend on the policy design. This will depend on many things. So this is what we try to emphasize. But their preference could switch, okay? So this means that it is important to engage all the potential persuadable individual, okay? We cannot just assume that there is some resistance among a group, they will just resist. No, we really try to engage them. Okay? And it means that we should carefully design the policies if we want to expand public backing. Second main result is that if we want to achieve a majority support, we should really focus on one of the 6 phases, which is the conditional middle. Okay? This is the largest group, 1/3 of the sample, and this is a crucial constituency which shape the support or rejection of the policies. Okay? Let me just show you this. So if this conditional middle in this group, if they switch the position from neutral, so those when they say they were neutral to support, in total, the number of policies that have the majority, it increased from 4 to 10. Okay? We had 4 before, only the green. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And now if we switch, it adds the yellow part. So this is the switch coming from the conditional middle. And then we have a majority for 10 policies, okay, from 4 to 10, okay, just by switching this group. Okay? Here it's another way to see it. So if this conditional middle switch, okay, from neutral to support, then the country, when we have majority support for at least 7 policies, we had 4 before. Now if they switch, we have 9. Okay? So from here to here. So 9 countries where we have this majority support for at least 7 policies. So this is changing one group can have significant impact. Now the question is how to motivate those conditional middle. And what we saw is that they are very sensitive to impact perception, whether the benefit or the cost. So maybe to focus on that would be a good idea. So in general, emphasize the positive outcome of a policy. This could enhance acceptance, okay, even among those who are more skeptics. And finally, what we highlight is the importance of strategically allocating the carbon pricing revenue, so the revenue of ETS, okay? Certainly, the supporter, they favor more the mitigation strategy, as I was mentioning before. But if we want to focus on the middle and the opposer, we should prioritize what they think is important, adaptation measure, and compensating the most vulnerable people. Okay? So those elements could be integrated into the climate policy package to potentially gain broader acceptance and broader support. I'll finish here. We have also a lot of different variables in this study that we didn't exploit. And just to mention, so if you're interested, you can reach to me. And we're also collecting now a second wave of data in which we investigate new policies, okay? And particularly policies on adaptation measure and some measure which focus much more on uncertainty and on policy fairness. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, so the observations you describe are stated preference, right? And we know that people don't always do what they say. So my question concerns the tax on the flights. I think the impetus began in Sweden with flight shaming or whatever. So how many people seem to express that sentiment across the sample of European countries you looked at? And then what fraction of people actually pay the tax? And if you have data by country on that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I have the data here. I could certainly look at it. No, it's true, certainly. It's stated preferences. And in this case, yeah, I should look at the data. I do not have the data here. And whether we can have the data that we want for that, this is a good question. Let me check what we have exactly and come back to you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. So you started your presentation with this idea that public opinion is important and is relevant. And I wonder whether actually your work is not showing exactly the contrary. Like, I have been actually struck by the fact that the people that vote for the nationalist parties at the EU, actually most of them are in the middle or supporters. Like the minority are the opposers, even though it's like a larger group compared to the others. And which actually raised me the questions of whether focusing on this public opinion or the general public is a relevant strategy to raise support for those policies. So I don't know whether you have a reflection on that. And maybe a second question was the convinced opposers in one of the other figures. I thought the result was quite interesting. You basically show that if a policy is more effective, the convinced opposers are also changing and being more supportive to the policy, which seems paradoxical, in the sense that if you are convinced that you don't want climate policies, if they are more effective, you should actually oppose them more, no? And I thought that actually was an interesting insight from the research. But anyway, it's really fascinating results, and I will reach out, I think, afterwards.
Thanks. Well, I do not really what to say in the sense that, sure, I mean, if we do not focus on the support, well, to me, it's kind of clear that we should, well, this is very important to focus on public opinion, because this could determine, and I think we do not know enough about what exactly determines, but I think that, yes, so if we investigate what exactly or more precisely could determine whether you support or not, etc. This certainly could be interesting, because then for policymakers, these are some elements that could be integrated. So going to that direction, I'm convinced this is something that could be that could be interesting. I agree here. So you were referring to that, right? So at some points, yes, this is yes, but it means that there are all these people here. So we also saw from the very beginning, I think this is one of the main problems, they do not know about climate policy in general, and we should do much more in terms of communication. I mean, people, when we ask, do you know the ET? Yes, it was, they do not know, and so we should emphasize much more the result, the impact, the benefit potentially, etc., if we want to gain support. And so to me, yes, this is a kind of reassuring result that there are so many people here. And going, I'm convinced that we should go into the direction of trying to convince them. Yeah, but I see a bit the point, yes. And about the convinced opposer, yes, I agree. I mean, we can certainly discuss in more details what we could do. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. Yeah.
My question is a bit related to what you just said, but because for me the conditional middle that you're talking about. My understanding is that they are already aware of climate change somehow, but just they don't want to implement all the policies that were decided somehow in this Fit for 55 package. So why is the goal to convince them? I mean, you make the hypothesis that this is the perfect package and we have to implement everything, but if you're taking care of public opinion, maybe the policies that they already agreed to implement somehow, can't we not just emphasize these policies because they are democratically accepted? And wouldn't it be enough to reach the Paris Agreement?
So I'm not completely sure that, so in the five, so there were the 5 policies that are already implemented. So this is 5 among the 15, right? And clearly there, yes, so what I'm not completely sure to see what you mean with this condition.
My question is like, why do we want to convince them to implement all the policies? If they already accept to have some, and can't we not just emphasize the policies that are accepted somehow?
Well, in the sense, did they accept? I'm not sure, because we didn't vote on that, right? So it was, so this is the first thing. So what is important, so it was imposed somehow. Okay, we voted for sure in general, for general election, but we didn't have any vote on particular policies. So this was, I'm not sure this was more accepted than some others. Yes, so there were all the discussion at the EU level, etc., what could be acceptable or not, and probably they discussed this a lot. But in general, I mean, this is clearly not enough, okay? And so we need extra policies, and we need to do more. And so there are all these policies that we would like to implement and that are discussed right now at the Commission, at the different, and so most of these policies that we presented are the ones that I discussed now. And so the idea is to see, okay, what are the policies that would gain some support, what are policies that would have less support, and what are the determinants of that, whether we can change, whether we can present them differently to obtain more support and to avoid like the carbon tax problem that we had, for example, in France. And this is a bit the idea. But I don't think there is very much a difference in terms of support between those who have been implemented already and those who are discussed.
Actually, I have a question to follow up on this last question, which is not questioning your results, but questioning your methodology. And because it is based on specific selection of 15 policies. Yes. Your definition of supporter or not supporter, conditional or committed, are based on the 15. Yes. So if I would repeat the survey and select a different 15 or select a 20 or whatever, I may get very different results.
Yes, this is correct. And this is also why we wanted to have this threshold approach instead of having like we could have some compute a degree of support, and but this would very much depend even more on the type of policy, because if some policy have a very high degree of support, then this is taken into account in the index. Here with a threshold, you have a bit less of that. But yeah, sure, it depends on this 15 policy. But remember that typically, most of the literature, I mean, it was either on one policy or whether you support climate policy in general. And here we wanted to go a bit deeper into having different policies and have the variation within individuals. Of course, we could have many more. Well, we try to limit the time of the survey.
But let's assume that in order to collect your data, you have to select a system of policies. The question is, can I analyze your data without making the definition of supporter or not supporter based on this selection of policies? And I think there is, because you proceed to ask for perceptions of policies. Why? I mean, the way I would propose to analyze the data will be to define supporter or not supporter based on the reaction to the perceptions. So define preference to policy in terms of the weight that people give to different perceived attributes of the policies. So it's maybe more difficult to explain, but it will be a different definition of supporter or not supporter, conditional or committed, based on the support as a function of the perception. Yes. So then, based on the reaction, based on the weight people give to different perceived attributes, then you can predict. Then you can develop from this information that will allow you to predict how people will react to a new policy that was not on the list.
I see the point. This is a very good point. And indeed, I mean, the choice here of the classification, this was really, we decide on that. To reassure you, we have also robustness analysis in which it's not only because we define why 5, why supporter is more than 5, why, of course, and then we try different approach. Surely the different group change a bit the composition, but mainly this is relatively stable. So we have all the robustness approach. But I agree with you, this is really ad hoc type of analysis. And we should try to see whether we can do it, to have this support as a function of perception.
A lot easier to explain than to explain what I have in mind. So it's clearly an advantage.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions? Oh, wow, many questions. Yes. The microphone is on its way.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your interesting talk. I'd like to know whether the between country heterogeneity in the response are lower or higher than the within country heterogeneity. In other words, is it as if the answers are as if they come from a unique sample at the AU level or from different sample? So it is about the fixed effect. If you have the country fixed effect, if you have some regular fixed effect, and to look at maybe are there some cluster countries? Because I was quite amazed by the fact that at the end of your presentation, you have the, let's say, Mediterranean countries, which seem in favor of, while northern countries seems less in favor of, which is maybe not what we find in the real policy which are implemented. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, this is certainly something to be investigated. I think we have some appendices which I should check the difference between countries. Certainly there are differences between countries, that's true. In this talk, I focused on the, well, kind of having the main message for the at the EU level. I didn't focus that much on the difference between countries, but yes, you saw, we had some slide in which we saw there are some difference, and we should, in the regression we included some fixed effect indeed. I should check exactly the results, but your point is definitely right, and there are differences. The answer is there are differences, which I didn't mention that much here, but there are, yes. And I can come back to you if you wish to on that. Yeah.
Thank you for your nice talk. I think it's a question not on your talk, but on the next talk. So you may say you have analyzed demand, but if you analyze demand in automobile market, you say, okay, there is also supply, there are price, and you cannot estimate demand without estimating price and the homogeneity problem and so on. So what is the supply here? I don't know really. Well, it's the information people receive. So you can receive two types of information, the word of mouth information, your social media, and so on, the people you know, or you can have people sending you information, but unfortunately these days, it's cheaper to send wrong information than to send right information. So maybe you have idea about your next research, if you have not done that, how to incorporate this side, because when you have election, of course, people get a lot of information before the election and they elect. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm certainly not the specialist of communication. I think this is, what we try to do is to emphasize that it could be important. Now, the way we do it, I think we need to really involve specialists on that. I'm not sure that as economists there are some people.
Do you ask what kind of source of information?
What
is your source of information? Media, social media, word of mouth, this kind of thing?
In this survey, I'm not sure we have. I should check. This is a good question. And if we have this information, this would be interesting, and especially, yes, to relate that to how knowledgeable they are about the policies, etc. Yes, I should check. I'm not sure we have this question.
You did measure the level of information. You didn't measure where the information
source
came from.
Yes.
The source. Yeah.
We didn't measure. We didn't ask. I'm not sure we asked. I should check. But yes, we measure whether how knowledgeable they were, but we didn't ask for the source, I think.
Any other questions?
Hi. Yes, I also wanted to ask for future research, or also maybe in this research, did you also measure other variables that are seen as mainly factors such as emotions or fairness or social norm that can actually make people decide, or conditions, factors that influence how people accept or not, or support or not policy? And also, I think in the last slide you mentioned about uncertainties. If you're going to, I don't know if this will be a new study, or you also measured how people perceived uncertainties of these policies or not, and yeah.
No, this is a good one. Well, in fact, yes, we have the second way in which most of the policy are changed. And indeed, we integrate, I'm not sure there are questions about norms, but I think there are questions, yes, about this fairness perception, okay? And this is an important factor to see how much they perceive that one policy is fair or not. And this is included. And about the uncertainty also, we include it, I mean, this is the plan to include. So this is to be run. So we really tried not to replicate too much and extend, but having kind of different approach and studying different types. So this is clearly part of it. So what you had in mind, yeah, clearly this is the plan to integrate. So if you're interested, do not hesitate to reach out. Yeah. Thank you.